Hello and welcome to Can You Hear Me at the Back, the podcast about all things voice and communication.
Hey, Leon.
Hi, Aundrea.
So, with a sound and a movement, tell me how you're feeling. Ooh. That reminds me of like Little Mermaid.
Really?
Yeah. No idea why.
Oh.
Yeah.
Aundrea, in a sound and a movement, tell us how you feel.
Quah, quah. Yeah. I think I was going for quail, but then
Quail?
Yeah. Quail has been in my head.
Have you ever had quail?
Don't think I have, no.
It's quite delicious, but they're also very cute.
Yeah, I've seen
They've
them.
got like little extra feathers around their feet. I was going to say paws. It's not paws. It's the feet. And then they have like little paddy feet where it looks like they're wearing flares or like bell-bottom trousers.
Oh, that's cute.
They're really cute.
Yeah.
Also delicious.
Oh. Well, I guess
Those two things are not mutually exclusive.
they're clearly not.
You have to remember this.
I mean, most of the most delicious things are very cute.
Yeah.
Lambs. Oh no, we can't get into that. Okay. So, what are we talking about today?
We are not talking about how delicious, beautiful things are. What we are talking about is the burden of communication.
Yes. Yes, we are. Yeah. And you know what? For like a hot second, I thought I had made it up because I couldn't.
Did you Google it and it didn't come up?
You know, it didn't. And I was
Oh.
like, I swear I remember somebody talking about this in one of my classes. And I realized, because then I started thinking, what if one of my professors just made it up and they were really talking about something else? But they had used the burden of communication. That's the only thing that stuck.
Oh.
But that's not true. It's an actual thing. And it's
right.
in...
Were you on normal Google? You went on like Google Scholar?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. No,
and you went onto Google Scholar and then it's like, ta-da!
I like proper
versus
Google
everywhere else, you're like,
No, it's still shady.
Shady.
It's called, it's by Lippy Green. And I think her first name is Rosin. It's Roisin. Rosin?
Roisin.
So
yeah, Roisin.
Roisin.
Like Roisin Connerty. Shout out to Roisin Connerty. If you want to be on the show, Roisin, get in touch. Love you. Carry on.
It's from 1997, something called English with an Accent. And so the burden of communication in that sense, in the sense that Lippy Green uses it, has to do with the way that we listen to people who have accents. And whether the burden of communication relies on us as the listener to understand them through the accents, or whether it is the speaker who has to, quote unquote, clarify or reduce their accent to be understood.
Because we talked about it in terms of like education, I suppose, a few weeks ago.
Yes.
A few episodes ago. And we were talking about a particular voice practitioner who happens to insist that you don't use those paralinguistic yes things, because she insists that her evaluation of the burden of communication will be whether or not you are able to do the thing she's asked you to do, or vice versa. But that's really interesting to put it into the context of accents and therefore being understood.
Yeah.
And whether it's your job to make yourself understood or somebody else's job to be receptive to the idea of being spoken to in a different accent.
Yeah, and it all has to kind of do too with language ideologies, which is something that it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So you have to watch the video to see the excitement in my face, because
it's in your voice. It's fine.
Okay.
Medium, sonic medium is lovely,
isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so so people like to people have different ideas of what a language should be, and I encounter this quite a lot in the UK about people who believe that certain things should sound a certain way because it represents a very particular thing. And I'm going to put this in the context just to be controversial of Shakespeare. Oh yes, that I get a lot of students who believe that Shakespeare should be spoken in a particular accent in a particular way because it is associated with that, and therefore the burden of communication lies on the speaker to uphold both that ideology and that sound to make it what we consider to be clear to the audience. But clarity is different for everyone.
Yes, it really is. I talked about this at the conference that we were at a few weeks ago, and about Kate Godfrey, who's the head of voice at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And in an interview that I did with her for my thesis research, that she was saying, clarity is really interesting and audibility is really interesting, and which was the subject of my research. And she said that her job is ostensibly to listen. And therefore the quality of her listening is very different. So she will hear things that possibly other people won't, but that's her job, and she's listening out for those things. So therefore is she more critical of the things that she can hear or can't hear than other people are, and therefore is she sort of hyper vigilant, or is it just necessary? Which I think is a fascinating thing. Because I was also talking about this with students this week, and having the conversation about whether you can actually hear something. So they say, I told two students that they were creating an R by moving a R sound by moving their lip towards their tooth. So it was R. So it was what's often referred to as a weak R. So really rather than really, or really, whichever R, whichever R it is you're creating, the quality of that R. But the quality of their particular R happened to be quite weak. And I'm quite vigilant about that. We've talked about this before on the podcast. But I'm quite vigilant about that because it was something that I had to remediate in my own speech as an actor and as a person. And so that's something that I'm particularly vigilant about, and I hear immediately because it's something that was very much brought to my attention. And there were other things that I never had a problem with, or rarely had a problem with, like final consonant sounds, which in the right context I quite enjoy. And in other contexts don't really bother about it. But on stage and broadcasting, definitely that's something that I'm conscious of. So I didn't really hear it because it was sort of already part of my common practice. My kind of vernacular, my kind of conversational language was pretty accurate in those terms. So it took me a really long time to be able to give those notes because I just didn't acknowledge that it was a thing. So it's been really interesting that some of the students saying to me this week, but I can't even hear it. How do you hear that? I can't even hear that. Like, well, you're doing it, so it's happening.
Well, I think that's a great thing because when we talked about when we had the listening episode, you listen from you. I tell my students that quite often. Is like you listen. We tend to listen from our perspective, and to listen from another person's perspective does take a huge kind of leap, and it does take a kind of consciousness to go, wait a minute. As somebody talks about empathetic listening, to go, wait a minute, how are you doing that? And a lot of times when you're doing accent, I do this a lot of accent, and I was like, well, if I'm going but she's going ah, and I was like, what? How do I get from mine to hers? Or whoever it is, and you kind of have to listen from their perspective in order to give them a note, because otherwise it won't make sense because you're giving a note from you and not to them.
That's fascinating, and I think you've just there's my filing cabinet. That's fascinating, and I think you've just hit on something that I've been trying to articulate for some time, which is really exciting for me. And for you, maybe. But because there are lots of directors that I have worked with who will give a note from their perspective without considering the actor's perspective at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more infrequent now, I have to say, but it used to be quite prevalent.
Yeah.
And people would say, no, why are you going in that direction? That's totally the wrong direction. And I think, well, it isn't the wrong direction, because that's the way that my instinct tells me to go, or my intention makes it feel like you should go, or you've already told me that I have to exit stage left and therefore I'm going stage left.
Right.
No, I want to go stage right. Oh, well, then, okay, fine. Well, I'll redo that in my head. But they're giving a note from an external perspective,
right?
Which is valid, but it's not taking into account what the actor process might have been, or my process might have been in those moments.
Right.
I've even had that on shows that I've written myself, and the director has said to me, "That's not what that means." And I was like, I know exactly what this means, because it came out of my head.
Yeah.
So I know that that's what that means.
Yeah.
If you don't understand it in that way, that's okay. But
yeah.
I'm telling you 100% I know what it means.
Yeah.
Because I wrote it. You might have a different interpretation of it.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you that the way that I'm saying it is what it means.
Yeah. And it's and that has a lot to do with what we talked about last time when we talked about maxims and flouting maxims and all that stuff of relevance, but also context. It's the same thing as if it's, because I think everyone kind of assumes that if we're speaking the same language, then we're communicating and everything's okay. But within that, there are other things that you might infer that I don't automatically know, because we're not starting out on the same premise. So you have to define the terms of the premise sometimes. And a lot of times when I'm not communicating,
we're back to defining terms, are we?
Yeah. When I'm not communicating with people, it's a lot of times it's like, well, this is what I meant by this, and they're like, oh no, wait, that's not what I got at all. But again, the problem that's if both people are assuming equal responsibility within the act of communication. You get a lot of people sometimes, and I think it's especially prevalent with accents, but I hear it all over the place. Where people are doing what I call lazy listening or lazy communication,
right?
Where someone's talking to you and you're just like, I'm good. And it's not, I don't get it, like what you're saying doesn't make sense to me. It's, I don't get it. I don't like, there could be a lot of things. It could be, I don't get it. I don't like it. And therefore like put it away. Or a lot of like, it's not being presented to me in a way that I like. And so I'm not listening.
Yes.
And you just automatically kind of tune out. And that's really prevalent for people who have accents and their first language isn't English. You see a lot of times if you're doing exchanges with them and like I used to work in Times Square and part of the frustration a lot of times that people have when they come to English is that English speakers don't have a lot of patience. They don't have a lot of because they believe that there should be an equal burden of communication. If I'm communicating to you, you should receive that communication and then and then throw it back at me so that we could have this dialogue, especially if you're in New York, because things just work very, very quickly.
Fast, yeah.
But a lot of times what you'll get is, I'm giving you this, and they're going, oh, wait, I don't understand that. Could you possibly, just like your actor note, could you possibly do it in a way that would be more contextually relevant for me? And that sometimes means that you have to substitute words, right? So instead of saying chair, I might say
seat.
Yeah, seat, exactly. Yeah. And you might understand what a seat is, but you might not understand what a chair is, because I don't know, maybe you're having a Spanish day and your head is just in Spain and also not in English.
Probably comes down to idiom as well in that instance. Like if you were to say to somebody, pull up a chair or take a seat, they're like, what? If you said, would you like to sit?
Yeah.
Or please sit down. They'd be like, siéntate.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
He was like, I got it.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very big thing, but it always has to do with, just like we talked about last time in terms of cooperation, in that we assume that if I'm going to have a conversation with you, then we are going to cooperate in some way to make the communication work. It's the same way with kind of the burden of communication. It's that, person A is coming in with the understanding that I'm going to give you something, and that you're going to work relatively hard to get that. And if you don't, then I will work equally as hard to give it to you so that you can understand it.
Right. Mm. So that there is a reciprocity, there's an equality to the burden of communication in that discourse, rather than somebody just having to listen harder or speak better.
Yes.
Or code switch.
Or code switch.
Which also came up in conversation this week with some students, because one student was telling me that when they speak to almost anybody that has a different accent or a different language to them, they code switch into whatever it is that they're doing. So
the person who they're trying to talk to.
That they're speaking to. Okay. So then they try and sort of assimilate their sounds to be similar to the person to whom they're speaking to.
Which is nice. It could be dangerous, but yes, exactly.
But this is exactly it. And this particular student was saying to me, yes, when I was in Italy, I just kept doing an Italian accent at people.
Right.
And it was really bad. And I was like, yeah, that is really bad.
Yeah.
Which kind of is similar to the conversation we had in Code Switching episode about the football manager who code switched so extraordinarily.
Yes.
Poorly that well, it's extraordinarily well actually, but in the wrong moment, into a sort of faux foreign language kind of code, and so that's quite interesting to sort of note as well, that sometimes the burden that might come from that intention, that to try and equalize the burden of communication. I'm not going to be too alien, I'm not going to be too foreign for you, and therefore try and sort of make it easier for you to understand, and that probably isn't going to work.
No,
it will make you look a bit silly. But
yeah, it will. But I think that's also about privilege and language privilege as well, which is like a whole nother thing. But I think to
quote Catherine Ryan, your privilege is showing.
Was this a wonderful quote? But I think I think in a more kind of social and political sense, there are, English is a language of privilege, in the sense that it is spoken throughout most of the Western world, and we do have the luxury to be able to kind of even like go on holiday now and not have to even learn another language, because a lot of people will speak English. And I think within that privilege comes the ideology that anyone who comes to English from a different language has to work harder because my language is dominant. And that's the ideology that I think a lot of people are working within. Not judging it. I'm just saying that it exists. And then to move, and then it does become strange when you go into a different country, say Italy, and you're trying to, and you're hearing English spoken with an Italian accent, and you're trying to align yourself with that, and you do start to kind of code switch into that, because maybe it's conscious, maybe it's unconscious, but your language does hold a lot of privilege, and it does start to seem that you're kind of pushing that in people's faces a little bit. It's no longer I want to communicate with you, but it does take on an extra layer of meaning of kind of like, look, I've got this, I've got all these skills in my native language that you now have to speak, and and let me see if I can adapt what I already know for you, and that's
and yet there's sorts of things where you can. The example I gave to the students was that when I speak to my francophone cousins and other family, that I won't use the polite conventions of British English.
Right.
So I won't say, could I possibly have, if it's not too much trouble, a glass of water?
That's confusing.
Because then, if there's somebody English and I say, if it's not too much trouble, is it possible that I could have a glass of water?
Yeah.
Then someone would say, oh yes, absolutely, of course. How do I reply to you?
Yeah.
However, that just confuses, and I am flouting the maxim of quantity.
Both, actually.
Both at the same time. So the cues are difficult. We know this, but then I'm over egging the pudding to go back to my previous metaphor. But the idea is that actually then I don't need to. I can still communicate efficiently by saying, "May I have a glass of water?"
Yeah.
And that's enough. Mm-hmm. Or actually, can I have water? Mm-hmm. Because the qualifier of some isn't really necessary because somebody's probably going to give you enough to quench your thirst rather than like, here's a drop. It's like,
yeah.
And also that's not a quantity anyway. Some's not a quantity.
No.
It's relative. So, you know, some salt, it's scalar, isn't it? Yeah. So it's like some salt versus some water. Yeah. It's very different.
Versus like a few of this or a little. That's a UK thing. Can I get a little bit of, or can I have a little? And you're like,
my grandmother used to say just a teaspoon. I'd be like, what of that? How much do you want? She'd go, just a teaspoon.
See, my grandma said a sliver.
Oh, sliver's nice.
Yeah. So if we were cutting pie or something, she'd be like, can I get if you're like, do you want any pie? She'd be like, oh no, I don't want any pie. And she'd be like, well, can I get a sliver? This is a sliver.
Yeah, no, all of those terms more is German for me. Ambition, like, or it was more Yiddish, a bissel of this or a bissel of that.
Yeah.
Or those sorts of things because it wasn't English. So, but like the teaspoon thing or the sort of the sum or the sliver or the something is kind of, it's too much information.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes it becomes convoluted if you start to include all of those things. Mm-hmm. And yet, I also introduced a colleague this week to the term lingua franca. Mm-hmm. Which is Latin for
as most things are.
As most things are, yeah. So lingua coming from like language, and then franca coming from sort of honest but also free. Mm-hmm. So it's a free language that is, or it's the language that's most shared or shared in a given circumstance, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it is English.
Right.
It could mean that it's something else, but it's a common language. So if you had a German and an Israeli, and neither of them spoke English, but both of them spoke French, then the lingua franca would be French.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be English, but it tends to be a dominant language.
Yeah.
Like French, like Spanish, like English.
Right.
And so the sort of notion of the lingua franca is quite important in a sense, because then there's like European Parliament English, and that's a sort of ease of itself, as in like it's a kind of paralect of itself. It's a register of itself because it incorporates different syntactical rules, and it also incorporates different vocabulary. So you might just have a smorgasbord of vocabulary, for want of a less meta phrase. But it's there are lots of things. You use the most sort of easily accessible word, and everybody sort of has to muddle along, and it's kind of all right.
Yeah.
And so kind of going back to what the students were doing and changing the code too significantly, that actually then if you pare it down rather than try and switch it completely, that then what is it that I'm actually trying to say?
Right.
And how can I just efficiently communicate that so that I can be understood?
Yeah.
That I can honour the conversational maxims.
Yeah.
But then also honour my burden of communication, so that then there is clarity in what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to sort of flower it up and make it all sorts of beautiful.
Yeah.
Because that's not important when all you want is a sandwich and a beer.
Yeah. You need to get to the least oh gosh, I'm gonna use a math term, the least common denominator. In that kind of a sense. Yeah. And I think my biggest thing with with sort of the burden of communication in that sense, because I mean it goes into a lot of directions. So we've obviously gone into like maxims, and we've gone into code switching, and we've gone into ideologies and all of this kind of stuff. But I think what's really important for me in all of that is that there's so much in communicating, but it doesn't have to. But it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be a hugely complicated thing. I think people get, and this has a lot to do with people who have like social anxiety and all these things, because when you look at it, if you study language or you study social interaction, it does look, you can make it quite complicated.
Sure.
You can make it extremely complicated, but if you're taking it down and you're looking at, I'm trying to get this from this person, or I'm trying to communicate just this one thing from this to this person, then it is quite simple. And all you really do have to think about is, what is the best mode of getting that information into that person?
Mm-hmm.
And it might actually not even be linguistic in that sense. Like, we might have to turn another realm and talk about body language, or even written, like, orthography or something like that, or even just kind of paralinguistic, like sounds, which convey so much, and so they are quite important in that sense. And they carry on the idea of communication being kind of existing outside of the realm of linguistics, but also encompassing linguistics as well, and encompassing. That's why I like voice, because voice is not just about language. Right?
That's very true.
Voice is about communication, but it's not just about language. And
a bit like this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. I did that on purpose.
All things voice and communication.
Yeah.
That's kind of a byline.
Yeah. But it's kind of a wonderful thing in that sense. Because it is about communicating from one person to another person. Yeah. And language will come into that, and ideologies will come into that, because people are complicated and evolving beings.
Yeah.
But it is kind of just about, like, I just want to talk to you. I want to tell you things.
Yeah, and so many people fall into traps and pitfalls in the attempt to be understood. Mm-hmm. So, and what they do is they don't necessarily take responsibility for the communication, for the burden of communication. So, like the classic British tourist abroad shouting louder to try and make that clearer, because clearly the person that they're speaking to is hearing impaired. Almost never is that a thing.
Don't do that.
Then you're just shouting at somebody, and shouting, as we know, doesn't make you clearer.
No.
It just makes you louder and more offensive generally. But it's less likable. and that sandwich you've ordered might have somebody spit in it later on. But it's unlikely, again, very strict hygiene rules. But the point really is that it's about the burden of communication in that moment, that maybe the tactic that's being employed in that moment is just not the most effective. I was going to say sophisticated, but you're right, effective is absolutely right.
Sophisticated would work too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I like that too, and I know it's a very cliche thing to say, but I always talk to my students about why they're speaking. Because there are other modes of communicating whatever it is that needs to happen. So why at this moment has your character decided to start speaking? And sometimes it can be a simple thing as, like, well, somebody talked to them, so I gotta respond in some way. And it's like, yeah, but there are other ways of responding. There's that's a response.
Yeah.
There's also kind of like and that's also a response too. I just did, for those who are not watching, I did a thing with my hands. But like those are all equal parts of communication. So why at this point did somebody decide to write a 4-page speech to communicate something?
Yeah, it's that thing with actors, often student actors, doesn't tend to be as many professional actors as student actors, but say, well, I haven't even got any lines.
Yeah.
Which makes me rage. Actually makes me rage. But I sort of understand their point, and yet simultaneously kind of think, well, you're all upset about not having lots of lines, but it's not about what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's about what your reactions are.
Yeah.
And if you're still in the scene and you're still present in the scene, then there has to be a response to what is being said. If you're paying attention, if you're not paying attention, you're just reading a book in a corner, then that's fine. You're just reading a book in a corner, but then I've never ever seen a play where that's really a thing. I'm just trying to think of if there is a play. Please tweet me ideas of plays where there is just somebody sitting in a corner reading a book, and that's all they do for the whole scene. I'd really love to read it. Because also I will set it for my students as a scene study because that would be wonderful.
Oh, that'd be really cool.
Yeah, I'm evil. So no, I'm a really good teacher. That's the difference. I'm trying to really push the boundaries of what they believe scenes to be. But you know, like it's one of those things that you actually, and sometimes we do just sit there and listen. And that's okay. That's a normal human thing to be doing. Sometimes you don't have anything to contribute.
Or sometimes you don't need to. That's another thing.
Also more important than what I said.
Yeah. I work a lot with people, and because I too sometimes struggle with this the accepting of silence. I really struggle not to say anything. I was like, I get it, but that sometimes silence is the greatest communicator.
Yes, a little bit like stillness.
And
lots of fidgeting on stage is distracting. It's not captivating.
Yeah.
And sometimes people can be extraordinarily still, and they are sort of the latency of somebody's stillness and the potential for movement is just mind-blowing and extraordinary.
Yeah. So, Leon.
Yeah.
What did you learn?
What did I learn? I learned that within accents we can think about the burden of communication being present, which I hadn't really thought about in the context of accents as a burden of communication. And I know that people change their accent if they're asked to repeat something.
Yes.
So they become more sort of neutralised, or they become more in their accent, so their vowels shift, or they end up splitting the words and they become more emphatic.
Yeah.
Or they get louder, or a combination of all of them.
Yeah.
And then they often give up, usually after 3, sometimes 4 attempts. But the context of it being about accent is really interesting. Like, is it my job to change my accent so you understand me? Or is it your job to be able to understand me because I'm speaking the language?
Yeah.
And I talk about this a lot when I'm doing accent coaching with cohorts rather than with individuals.
Right.
Because I talk about the notion that actually we have an extraordinary capacity to understand that an E is still an E, even if it's E.
No,
until it then becomes and then it becomes and then it becomes and it as the tongue moves and the vowel starts to shift, we kind of go, oh, it's E for ages, and then it's like kind of like ping, and then it's like that's an and it goes ping, and it's like that's an and you're like, how did? And on the other direction, there's this massive overlap where it still stays an until it then goes click, and it's now an and then it goes click, and then it becomes an E, and you're like, how is it that my brain has got this huge capacity to just understand what the vowel sound is in that area? And sometimes the set's completely shifted. So a strut set's become a book set, or vice versa, or whatever. But we still have this sort of extraordinary capacity in English that it sort of just allows for that broadness.
Yeah.
And yet, if you've never heard people speak differently to you, you might not be able to even understand it.
Oh, Welsh took me quite a bit of time. That was very difficult for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it had nothing to do with the vowels, but it had everything to do with the intonation.
Yeah, the prosody.
Oh my goodness!
And then working with students to make them sound more RP when they want to do RP.
Yes.
They find that extremely difficult. I don't feel like I'm doing anything with my voice. It feels really flat. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was, yeah.
And what did you learn, Aundrea?
But I really want to talk about language ideologies and ideologies in general.
Okay. Yeah.
I had a big thing with that's because I had a professor that I really, really liked who taught me about language ideologies. Yeah. And in a nice way.
the good teacher paradigm of interest.
Yes.
Why do you like this? I had a really good teacher.
That's why I became a teacher, though. It's because I had a few really
good teachers. I didn't. That's a whole other podcast.
That is. Yeah, absolutely.
If you want to contact us about anything we said in the podcast, you can reach us on Twitter at CanYouHearPod.
Or on Instagram at CanYouHearMePodcast.
Or you can search for us on Facebook and on YouTube.
Or email us at canyouhearmeattheback@gmail.com.
You can find me, Leon, on Twitter at Leon Trayman.
Or me, Aundrea, at Aundrea Fudge on Twitter.
Please support the podcast by subscribing as a patron on our Patreon site.
The link is in the show notes.
To keep the podcast advertisement-free, as well as get access to cool extra stuff, discounts, bonus episodes, as well as supporting ongoing voice research funding as well. Okay, love you, bye!